All of the maps in Nightingale feature water of some kind, including lakes, rivers, waterfalls, swamp water, and coastline. As the positioning of these water bodies was part of the procedural map generation, it was impossible to place audio emitters by hand. There are many ways to tackle water ambience, especially if spline data is available, and luckily this was the case. One option is to take multiple positions spread out evenly along the spline and feed these into a multi-position emitter. There are a few downsides to this though. Depending on the granularity, you could end up with gaps between the positions which lack a close perspective audio layer. Also, a multi-position emitter tends to lose its directionality when using too many sources, as they all share the same sound. There are also technical considerations behind this, such as managing a huge number of positions in a large map. Another option is to have an emitter move along the spline at the closest point to the camera. This ensures the emitter will always be close by when approaching the water. This is the method we decided to go with, although this also has its problems. This works fine along a stretch of coastline which is fairly straight, but due to our procedural map generation, our coastline could end up with fairly complex shapes, including peninsulas. This introduces a problem where the emitter is simply looking for the closest spline point and ends up snapping across the terrain. Also, it didn't sound right to only have coast ambience on one side. Our solution was to divide the map into quadrants, using the camera as the center, and use 4 emitters instead of 1. As the player moves, these emitters smoothly update their positions to the closest spline point within each quadrant. If they get too close to each other, one of them will slowly fade down and give way to the other. This method could handle much more complex coastline and produce ambience all around the player instead of just on one side. If the player decides to swim away from the shore, we have an emitter which follows the player to make sure there is always water ambience around them. Quite late in development, the environment team added a method of producing waves breaking on the shore. This gave us the ability to trigger an audio event for an individual wave breaking. There is also a method to detect the terrain under the waves, and we have different sets of wave audio for sandy beaches and rocky shores. There are also different layers based on distance, covering a close, medium, and distant perspective, which blend in wise. Lakes are essentially the inverse of the coastline, with quad emitters placed around the spline. Like the ocean, there is an emitter which follows the player if they go out into the middle of the lake. For lake ambience, as well as gentle lapping, I added randomized one-shots of frogs and insects around the shoreline. This helped lakesides to feel more unique, as well as relaxing when carrying out an activity like fishing. Handling swamp water was a challenge, as there is water and small areas of land almost everywhere in this biome. Instead of adding lots of interconnecting lakes with their own spline data, it was easier for the environment team to treat the swamp as one giant lake. The height map was then used to create areas of dry terrain. So without any spline data, we had to approach this differently. We created a grid around the player and fired raycasts from these locations to check for terrain. If no terrain was detected, this location was added to a multi-position emitter. This gave us fairly accurate positional water ambience around the player. For rivers, we already had the spline-driven audio, but the VFX team also added water splashes on rocks along the river. We were able to use these blueprints to determine the speed, depth, and width of the river at each point, and play different audio loops based on this data. As waterfalls are loaded into the map as pre-made blueprints, we were able to add audio emitters to these by hand. They have multiple audio layers based on distance. That wraps up how we handled water ambience in Nightingale. In the next video, I'll cover how we approached ambience and mix changes for interiors,